Good morning.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Startup Innovation in the Open RAN Ecosystem. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items to show you how to participate in today's event. You have joined the presentation listing using your computer speaker system by default. If you prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dialing information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send your questions in at any time during the presentation. We'll collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded. You will receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with the link to view the recording. I would now like to introduce Diane Ronaldo, Executive Director of the Open RAN Policy Coalition. Go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much. Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited for this program. I have to say, I've been looking forward to this event for some time. The coalition formed 1 year ago to advocate for more competition, which will lead to greater innovation. These startups are proof that by lowering the barrier to entry, you'll create a more robust supply chain while driving the next generation of networks. I'm pleased to introduce our co-host for today's event, Open RAN Policy Coalition founding member and founder and CEO of XCOM Labs, Paul Jacobs, and Cohere Technologies CEO, Ray Dolan. They will lead a conversation with FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr, followed by a panel of our founders and CEOs. Commissioner, thank you so much for joining today. I know you'll be in great hands, and I look forward to hearing the conversation. So I will let you all take it away.
Thanks, Diane. Really appreciate it. Really excited for the conversation today. I'm Paul Jacobs, and I'm the founder and chairman and CEO of XCOM. I was previously CEO and chairman at Qualcomm, so I've been in the industry for a little while. Ray, it's great to see you again. We obviously have a long history together, and Commissioner, thanks so much for joining us. I used to spend a lot of time at the FCC in my Qualcomm days, and it's really exciting things that are going on there. You guys have done a wonderful job, and look forward to having a conversation with you. We wanted to start off the fireside chat with a question about some comments that you had made at an FCC forum on 5G open radio access networks last year, and you compared Open RAN to the unbundling of the PC market, where that really created competition and diversity in this market that had been vertically integrated in the old mainframe days. And I think in recent years we see a lot of new innovators, emerging companies entering the mobile ecosystem, as we're now moving towards these architectures that are more open and interoperable. And so just really interested in your comments on how you see this increase in new players entering the market, the benefits of a more diverse ecosystem. And maybe as a follow-on, one of the thoughts that I had, thinking about this unbundling and the analogy to the PC market was this notion that the PCs also got sold into a broader range of enterprise customers, and that analogy also applies to wireless, that will want to have private networks, and different users will have different applications, and seems like that will open up a much broader market for these smaller companies to sell into. So very interested in your thoughts on that as well.
Well, thanks so much. I think you're exactly right. Yeah, and Paul and Ray, really an honor to get to join you all. I'm looking forward to maybe getting to lob some questions back your way and learn some from this panel. And thanks obviously as well to Diane and her organization, the Open RAN Policy Coalition. There's a lot of organizations and associations in DC. Some of them have been around for quite a while. And one of the things I love about this organization is that it's fresh, it's new, and it's really part of what I think is going to disrupt the wireless industry in a way that's going to be very beneficial for consumers, for innovation, and for competition. You're right. The way I think about ORAN is through this lens of unbundling. And I joked earlier that in the 1990s, the internet pioneer Mark Andreessen and Jim Barksdale, the IBM veteran, coined a now famous corporate world phrase, which is there's only two ways to succeed in business: bundling and unbundling. And the two of them were definitely on the unbundling side. This was when they were pitching their new venture, Netscape Communications, and they were trying to break into sort of a nascent market that was dominated by bundled or vertically integrated systems, ones like AOL. And we've seen that trend throughout sort of the history of technology. You mentioned the PC market, which I've talked about. That's one where the first Apple PCs were bundled. The software and the hardware came together in a way that was really prohibitively expensive for a lot of families. And that's when Microsoft saw an opportunity to improve the consumer experience through unbundling. So they decided to make a standalone business out of just one part of Apple's business, the operating system. They didn't have an interest in the rest of Apple's PC business, the hardware side. They let IBM go after that. They let Dell go after that. So by separating the software and the hardware in the PC business, that's when we saw real disruption enter the market. Prices were driven down to a point where more families could afford it, and it helped power innovation. And to me, that's the lens through which I see ORAN as well. Up to now, we've had these, expensive, bespoke, vertically integrated hardware, software systems. And one thing that a lot of, sort of casual observers don't know is you can have basically entire cities or entire markets that are, effectively owned by one vendor, because a lot of these systems don't talk very well to each other, if at all. And so with ORAN and unbundling, what we're doing is driving that same dynamic that we saw in the PC market. So now anybody can compete at the hardware level with sort of standardized equipment. That's going to drive the prices down. And then we leave room at the software layer for real true innovation to take place. One of the great things about that is that means you don't have to be a, $15, $20 billion research and development operation to get into the game. You can get into the game through coding, through software, and that plays to an enduring American strength in software innovation. And so you can get a lot of different, small, medium, large US-based companies that can now compete for this type of business that Open RAN is going to help usher in. So we're really excited about it. We think it's going to be a more secure way to go forward, give people options outside of Huawei and other gear. It's going to drive prices down. We think it's going to be a more efficient network as well. So we're pretty excited about what it can do, and we can get into it, but we're trying to strike a balance too at the FCC where we give this a chance to flourish, but without unduly putting a thumb on the scale.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the interesting thing for us too in our company is the ability to, innovate on a very particular part of the system, use commercial off-the-shelf hardware, that then allows us to really build software to drive these, incredible advances in throughput in the system. So I completely agree with that, with your point of view there. Ray, you might be on mute.
Yeah, sorry about that. I find that analogy to be particularly striking. I totally accept Paul's comment on the enterprise play here and the need to deconcentrate, if you will, the current architecture, because right now it's highly concentrated within licensed players, but opening that network has the potential to do that. I also find it really, really cool, to be honest with you, that two fairly small companies took some really arcane pieces. We now know them so well, we don't think they were arcane, but like the whole notion that silicon could become a platform as opposed to being buried inside of a techie world, and that this notion of an operating system would have the leverage that it had. That was by no means obvious, or frankly, some of the people would never have made the choices they made, right? But it was the folks that decided to focus on that. Some of them die and some of them become great companies. Paul's experience at Qualcomm is frankly another example of that. Had nothing to do with the PC per se, but it had a lot to do with meeting an industry at a fork in the road and going down a different path and saying, we're either going to win or we lose on the merits of our argument. And obviously it became one of the great US industrial companies, still is today.
Yeah, I think one of the points there was, the government didn't step in and make a technology choice that was done in other places, and our market allowed innovation to flourish. So I think Ray, it really does underline the point that getting a diverse ecosystem is really important.
Yeah, and it may be things that are arcane. I mean, in our company, we happen to be working on the spatial side of channel modeling. There's a lot of folks that don't even understand that that could be one of the equivalents of an operating system that's currently buried inside of systems right now. It's not even defined by the standard. If in fact it's done right, it could be moved to the cloud. And all of a sudden now you embrace the category killers of cloud communications that are welcome to come into the wireless space. Up until now, that's been a black box. So we're very excited that you're championing the notion of Open RAN without a foot on the scale or a finger on the scale. There does need to be some level of evangelization and support, and potentially even small investments, but it doesn't need to be created as a category in the industry. It'll take care of itself because the openness, and Eric later will talk about one of the examples he's done with their company. The openness is enabling business models to really flourish on the hardware side as well. If you don't mind, maybe we could segue, unless you have other things that you'd like to talk about on this topic, Commissioner. There's another related topic. It's all the rage right now about U.S. leadership and the risks associated with not having, like large U.S. companies creating architectures going forward, and also security. And there's a combination of those two aspects that probably play to many of the policy levels that you think about as a commissioner and more broadly across the FCC, that networks have to be secure for the digital economy to run safely. And US companies need to play a significant role, potentially significantly greater than they do right now, and how Open RAN can enable that. I'll give you a chance to just talk about that if you have some points of view.
Yeah, network security is a top priority for a lot of us in government, and we've taken a lot of targeted actions against entities, like Huawei, like ZTE. And one quick story that I tell that helps illustrate this: I was up in Great Falls, Montana, up at Malmstrom Air Force Base. This is one of the most remote parts of the country. It's also where we keep the nation's one of the nation's ICBM missile fields. It's spread across hundreds of miles up there, and there's just nothing there. It's wheat fields and big sky country, but dotted throughout that missile field are cell towers running high-end Huawei gear. And the types of threats that can be posed from that are difficult to overstate. So we have taken concrete action to prevent subsidized Huawei gear from going into the network. We're engaging in this rip and replace process right now to take that gear out of the network. And we think that's part of the answer to that security threat, is giving carriers even more options for replacing the type of performance that they went to Huawei for before. And so O-RAN is going to allow us to replicate a lot of that functionality at the software level, so you get more choice, more competition. If you choose, you can go to US-based companies to do that. We think that's going to give a much more secure performance. And as we go through that rip and replace process, we want carriers to feel comfortable with making a decision for themselves. Do they go with more traditional infrastructure, or do they move forward with O-RAN based approach? And we think part of what we can do with the FCC is help promote the idea that O-RAN is out there. It's an option. I think particularly for smaller companies that are, a lot of them are the ones that are engaged in the rip and replace. They have been sort of slowly dipping their toe in the water and trying to get more comfortable. So I think the organization that you all are part of, forums like this are really good from the educational perspective. But we think this is going to be good for security and good for U.S. leadership. So I mean, again, sort of bottom line, and it's sort of two-pronged. One is we're dealing directly with the threat posed by insecure gear, and on the other vein with O-RAN, we're trying to give an opportunity for innovation to flourish so that people can feel like they have more choice in this space.
I think it's obviously we're all very excited about this transition to more open and interoperable interfaces in the radio access network, and I'd just be interested to hear what you're thinking about globally in terms of how to push that forward, how to get Open RAN and these new architectures more adopted in around the world.
Yeah, we recently voted at a notice of inquiry at the FCC, which I think is a good step in the right direction. That's going to develop a record and help us, look for ways to continue to advocate for this globally. I think, we're at the right point in time now with this notice, making sure that, providers feel comfortable making this choice. So I think the FCC in the US is going to have an important voice globally to make sure that this process moves forward quickly. There may be a role on the infrastructure side for investments from the federal government. For my part, I've been focused on ways outside of funding that we could be helpful. One of the efforts that we've been engaged on the last couple of years is infrastructure reform. At the end of the day, we got to a point in this country where it cost too much and took too long to build out internet infrastructure. Back in 2016, for instance, providers built a total of 708 new cell sites in this country, which may sound like a lot sort of when you hear that the first time. But in 2019, after we had modernized some infrastructure rules, providers built over 46,000 new cell sites. That was a 65-fold increase. And that's all going to be helpful, I think, in this shift to O-RAN. Because when we talk about swapping out radios, swapping out antennas, that's work that before some cities, may have put you through the regulatory hoops, the same regulatory hoops that you would have needed to put up a 200-foot tower. So by driving down those costs, making it easier to upgrade existing cell sites, we think that's going to help speed the transition to O-RAN as well. So I think it's important going forward that we do that. In fact, as we talk in DC generally right now about infrastructure reform, I think permitting, sort of regulatory approvals needs to be a part of that. And I haven't seen that yet. I've seen a lot of talk about funding, but if you're just providing money and not further streamlining the actual permitting processes that are the real barrier to infrastructure bills, then I think you're just jumping on the gas and the brakes at the same time. So I want to see if we can inject into that conversation more about how do we make it easier from a permitting perspective to upgrade existing sites.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was going to make that point later on. Is there's this whole notion of building out infrastructure, and that's become a sort of a politically charged word. But the industry used to come to you and advocate for lots of spectrum, and that was obviously a fundamental thing. You've put out a lot of spectrum now, probably broken some piggy banks with some of the spectrum auctions here. But there's a lot out there, and Ray and our company, we're trying to make that spectrum as efficient as possible. Now I think infrastructure is really the play. It's like, how do you get siting, not just for cell sites, but for edge computing and things like that. And the other thing that's super important is fiber. Like there's going to be very dense, deployments, not just of small cells, but remote radio units spread out, and then we'll do joint processing, all of those to get very, very high performance from it. So that kind of infrastructure is super important now to get more fiber availability around, along with the siting, so that these remote radio units can get deployed and we can get these massive gains out of this joint processing that both of us are talking about and working on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let me lob one back to you all. So obviously you two have been very deeply involved in sort of the mobile ecosystem for quite a long time. Based on your experience, what do you think is helpful for people like me or others in Washington to hear, so that we're striking this balance where we're not putting a thumb on the scale for one technology or another, but that we're able to sort of allow, the ongoing market forces to drive in the right direction?
Ray, you want to start?
Sure. Basically, the open architecture is huge, and I would just say it can't be championed enough. The other is really opening the architecture to the enterprise so that they can play. Way back in the early telephony days, the businesses paid for the development of a network that consumers rode on. In the last 10 years or so, that's been almost the opposite in wireless. It's kind of a unique space, but I do think we're on the verge of reversing back to where enterprises that have so much value that they can deliver by bundling coordinated cloud-based automation and tools in their products, they'll fund a lot of the build out of these networks, and consumers will get those benefits. But it's going to have to be done in some creative ways, because there's a lot of policy complication to like allowing an enterprise to pay for a paved network and actually ask for what they need in return and not make it look like they're looking for advantages. All they're really looking for is, can I drive the network expansion in collaboration with one of these operators or multiple operators and get like a Tesla channel or an Apple channel or a Facebook channel if it's a social media play, right? So that my service runs better. And if I ask for that, I'll pay for that. And what the operators will be able to do with that money is build bigger networks, and the consumers are right on top of it. I think some of the policy issues associated with looking hard at who pays for these networks and getting them to be opened. Paul mentioned it earlier, the compute industry is a great example of a horizontalization that was driven by technology change. But part of it was also that the structure of the industry changed radically at the very same time, probably enabled by the technology, probably the other way around. It was a little bit of a chicken or the egg, but we're going to need to do network carving so industrial automation can happen on a factory floor. And those factories are going to be networked across multiple places. And I'm just thinking that the enterprise is going to play a bigger role in here. Paul, I think that's something that you're pretty passionate about, but if you want to kind of chime in on the back end of that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think making sure that we can roll out for enterprises and as Ray said, all the tools that are going to be required. But I think also, it's the question of how do networks interoperate, private network with the public networks. We were just doing some testing in a football stadium, and the operator had to turn down the public network just because while we were testing, we didn't want handoffs between the private network and the public network. And so figuring all of that stuff out, there's definitely work and I think some policy there. But I think I would go back to the statement I made earlier. I mean, infrastructure is going to be very key for this next generation of rolling out 5G. You've done a great job on the spectrum side, but if I think about, wireless as sort of like sprinklers watering a lawn, we need the hoses to get to the sprinklers, and we need more places that we can put the sprinklers and make it easy to put the sprinklers out there. And that, because this joint processing that we're both doing, it depends on you having lots of radios, and it makes it easier to deploy them. So you're not having to do this, really tough frequency planning and everything for the siting. The systems handle that kind of stuff. And so we just need more places to put them, and we need the backhaul to attach them to that central processing.
Yeah, I think Ray, made a good point too, thinking about, the value that is derived from these networks, and that sort of, to some extent, goes to, the funding mechanism for all this infrastructure. And back in the day, we created this system where, we put a line item fee on, grandmother's plain old telephone copper line that pays for the network. And to some extent, that made sense because the value is being derived by those individual end users. And flash forward to today, and now we've got these trillion-dollar companies that are deriving a lot of value by delivering their services over America's world-leading high-speed networks, and yet we're still leaning on the grandmother paying a line item charge on her POTS bill to fund that. So I do think that should be part, going forward, of our conversation around infrastructure and supporting these high-speed networks.
I agree, and I think also, some of the funding for R&D has been great, and we have a project we're doing with the DoD, and there's money there for 5G innovation. And so I think the government as a whole has really kind of gotten around this idea about how do you pay for the networks, but also how do you pay for the innovation and create an open field that companies like Ray's and our company and the other startups that are going to be talking today, how can we actually break in, because we are going up against very large incumbents, and so and with very large budgets and lots of people going to standards bodies and all this other stuff. So the ability for us to break in and for the government to create that level playing field and that open open arena, and also for the funding as well. Just all these things coming together really are creating this exciting position that we're all in, I think.
Yeah, if I could offer another thought, Commissioner, one final thought, and then maybe give it back to you to offer yours to close. We've been in an industry that changes generations like every decade or so, and it just feels insanely slow, right? I don't know that you have individually or as collectively as an FCC any real opportunity to change that, except maybe allowing spectrum to be used with greater flexibility. Like, so if it's like, this is 4G spectrum, this is 5G spectrum, it's like, you know what, as long as you guys deliver you know, if you'll guarantee that you'll work on 4G, you can also experiment on other proprietary aspects of this. The notion of like 5G tried to get to autonomous vehicles, but it just missed it. Okay, so 6G, like we're going to wait 10 years for autonomous vehicles for another platform. It has to be like 5.2G or 5.3G or 5.4G. So as in the future, I think that the spectrum has to be viewed as a platform, and then application specific things can be done on it as long as they're compliant. And anything that the FCC in coordination with Ofcom and other players around the world can do to allow that level of innovation, that's how the compute industry changed. When you talk about the move to horizontal, it shortened the life cycle of upgrades dramatically. And then innovation happened on top of an OS and silicon platform instead of like the next generation came out 10 years later. And I'm just thinking there will be a world where, you know, special purpose devices like IoT devices will be able, if some global company makes one, cuts a deal with an operator to run that OS, the rest, you know, it doesn't have to be everywhere. It can just be something that's run on a T-Mobile network or run on a Verizon network. I dare them to do that because everybody else will go for that too, as long as there's enough money at it. But giving more flexibility to operators to do, as long as they do the baseline performance of conforming to 4G and 5G, allowing them to innovate with special derivatives on top of that would be great. Oh, I think of what you guys did. Go on.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. You know, you look at, I think some of the mistakes that Europe has made from a spectrum policy perspective, you know, they basically lock in technologies. This is 2G spectrum. This is 3G spectrum. One reason the US leapfrogged so much of the world to 4G when we were sort of behind in 3G is this concept of sort of permissionless innovation. Go ahead and sunset 1G, sunset 2G, put 4G on there. We used to have an approach where it was really bespoke, you know, this spectrum can be used for this purpose. And I think we've been trying to move away from that. I think to your point, we need to go further away from that. Even on the broadcast side, for instance, right? We've got, you know, rules that say, you know, you can only do ATSC, you know, X as opposed to, you know, upgrading to the next standard. And I've been trying to lean forward and say, no, let's allow people to upgrade technologies. To your point, they'll find the market need. You need to deliver IoT on this spectrum. What's the highest valued use? So we've done better than other countries in that regard, but I take your point that there's even more we can do to make sure that a range of technologies and services can be delivered over different spectrum platforms.
Great.
Sounds good to all of us. We want to innovate more, so the more flexibility, the better.
This has been a wild ride. I know, Paul, you've been in the industry a long time, as I have. What a wild ride it's been since the first site was built to where we are now. And frankly, it's possible that the biggest growth is in front of us. The diversity of opening this architecture could literally make it look like the advent of the compute world. And you know, and the diversification beyond 4 carriers to 4 federated carriers that end up looking like 30 carriers will create massive amounts of innovation.
And all the cool applications that are out there. You know, people have been talking a lot about the application side now. And obviously that was a big growth when we launched wireless internet, and then Silicon Valley and the internet players all kind of created all these services on top. But now I think it's also the enterprise side. I mean, everybody talks about industrial IoT and all these things, and I think that goes in with the private network notion as well. So we're just going to see, you know, kind of a science fiction reality start to happen with the robots and the autonomous vehicles and the AR and VR and teleoperation of things. I mean, it's, you know, telehealth, and you know, we've seen a lot of these things start to happen in the pandemic. Now they're really going to take off with this technology we put in place. So I wanted to say thank you to you and the FCC for creating this environment and making it possible for all of us to innovate this way.
Well, thank you so much for the chance to join you all for this conversation. We'll try to continue to sort of minimize the heavy hand of government intervention and allow you guys to let it rip in the private sector. And we're excited to see what happens.
Thanks
Great.
for that.
Thank
and
you.
Thanks for all your service, Commissioner. Right.
Yes.
Have
Thank
a
you
great
all.
day.
Thanks.
Good to see you, Paul.
All right. Good to see you, Ray. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Great. Thank you so much to our co-host and Commissioner Carr for being with us today. Next, I will ask that our moderator, Monica Paulini, please join. There you are, Monica, and the rest of our panelists for the next event. Monica, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. This is really a fun panel to be on, and we got a great introduction. And so what we have been seeing is all the innovation possibilities that were mentioned. Now, in this panel, what we're going to do, we're going to have more fun going forward, talk about some specific examples. So it is true that Open RAN opens the road to a lot of innovation. We're going to talk about 3 examples, which are clearly not exhaustive, but it gives you a sense of what happens when you open things up, when you create an environment that is more conducive to innovation. So, what we're not going to specifically talk about CUs, DUs, and the sort of the high level, the interfaces. This is Open RAN. In order to have Open RAN, you need open interfaces. Cool, and that brings all sorts of innovation. What we're going to talk today is how is that going to have a spillover effect over innovation across the entire wireless ecosystem. When you open things up, a lot of things that were still there, were already there, were possible, they get pushed forward. It's an acceleration. As Paul mentioned, we have COVID that pushed things forward. Open RAN is similar in that it creates the environment where things can move faster. And so this is quite exciting. And so we're going to talk about 3 different examples from the different panelists that I have today. So this is quite exciting. And then we initially thought that we're going to talk about more the technology, and then at the end we will see how can we encourage more of this? How can we get this further from a policy point of view? So said that, I would like to introduce my first 3 panelists. And by the way, you can ask questions, and I would encourage you to do so. So type them in, and we'll try to get them as soon as possible, possibly even before the end. So write in your questions. So today with me, I have Eric Stonstrom. He's the CEO at Airspan Networks. Hi, Eric. And Brian Deutsch, CEO at Pivotal Comware. Hi, Brian.
Hey, Monica.
And Tim O'Shea, who is the CTO at Deeptig. Hello, Tim. So what I would like to ask is, so that all of you in the audience know who they are and what they do, to give us a quick introduction of who they are, and then we'll go into the questions. So Tim, do you want to get started first?
Sure. So Deeptig is it's a small company. We're about 30 people, venture-backed, based in the DC area. And really our focus is on using a lot of the breakthroughs that have happened in machine learning and AI in the past 10 years and bringing that into radio signal processing. So bringing that into the RAN to help adapt the signal processing that happens there to be more efficient and more effective. So really this is about improving quality of experience when you're in the RAN, especially as we scale to massive MIMO and very complex, increasingly dense and complex systems, and really driving down power consumption, so making these systems more efficient, cheaper to deploy and operate. And so that's really kind of our major focus. Is we're focused on improving the software, kind of at the lower layers of the stack in the Open RAN ecosystem, and working with partners and Open RAN components to do that.
That's very exciting. So AI, automation, learning. Brian, what about you?
Thank you, Monica, and thanks to our RAN policy, and great session we had with Paul and Ray and the Commissioner Carr. It was awesome. I mean, the short answer for us is that we've cracked the code in deployment of millimeter wave ultra wideband networks. And, we feel very strongly that all the kind of the cool applications and devices that Paul was just talking about are really going to manifest themselves at millimeter wave. And in order for that to happen, we're going to have to make sure that these networks can be built with the lowest possible total cost of ownership and the quickest time to revenue. And to do that, we brought together some breakthrough beamforming technology we call holographic beamforming technology, and we built very advanced RF systems. And then on top of that, we have cloud native platforms for network simulation, network modeling, and propagation analysis, and also intelligent beam management service. We've put all of these systems and platforms and applications and services together to help, as Paul had said, to become the company that has the pipes and sprinklers that allows that metaphor to actually manifest itself, and for us to propagate that signal where it needs to go. So in essence, we come in on top of the mobility network that carriers will lay down, and these carriers can be the mainline carriers or they could be upstart greenfield carriers, and then we start to fill in the recesses and take what people think is lemons of millimeter wave propagation and turn it to wonderful lemonade.
Thank you, Brian. Eric, what about you?
Yeah, hi, Eric Stonestrom. Airspan is a company that has been in business for a while, but we are in a very rapid acceleration phase right now. We have a very deep experience in Open RAN. We have a very late major role in Japan and one of the biggest rollouts in the world, and actually in millimeter wave as Brian, but also in sub-6. We have over 1 million cells that we've deployed over the last several years in what I call our 4G integrated open architecture. So it wasn't O-RAN in terms of standards compliance, but it was us working with Samsung and Nokia and Ericsson in the ways that operators needed us to work to be able to make brownfield innovations to open their supplier landscape and give them a tremendous improvement in performance, spectral efficiency, cost, versus what I thought the previous group really addressed well as the IBM mainframe style approach that this industry has had for many, many years. So we're a real disruptor. Over half of our company is software based. We also produce very interesting hardware innovation, and we really are excited to be part of this. It's a final point I'll touch on is that we're selling now both to traditional carriers, but also greenfield operators like Reliance Jio in India, like Rakuten, and private. Our first quarter results showed tremendous growth in private 5G. So everything that the previous group talked about in terms of new entrants into the customer base is true, and we're seeing it firsthand. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so let's start with the sprinkler guy. And Brian, let me ask you, so you work on antennas and you started doing this before Open RAN was a thing, or just at the beginning, So how does working with Open RAN, or how is Open RAN changing the way you are working on your new products and taking them to the market? So, you need antennas in traditional RAN and an Open RAN. How does Open RAN changes the life of people to Comware?
So, we started obviously before even the predecessors of O-RAN, with XRAN. And so when we looked at the world, we wanted to make sure we could kind of disintermediate ourselves from the hegemony of, kind of the entrenched interest, in the telecom space. So what we decided to do is make sure we could come to market, whether it was 3GPP or O-RAN, with, a platform and an ecosystem that was fully compliant, with either one of these systems by using intelligent precision repeaters rather than actually trying to control, the 7-2 split or the RIC or the scheduler. And so we were very successful in working within the guidelines of those systems to actually promulgate a system that was able to propagate the signals where they needed to go. But as we evolved as a company, we started to see that, our antenna technology, which if for no other reason, that it's very efficient in terms of cost, size, weight, and power consumption, even for carbon emissions. When you look at what we do versus, say, a phased array, you can save several million tons of carbon dioxide. by putting holographic beamforming, a very lightweight power, stingy technology into base stations. Well, when we started to work our way into that marketplace, we saw that, the entrenched interests of the not invented here's were not going to afford us the opportunity to really crack our way into that. So, working with, other upstarts, but also other, more long-standing interests. Airspan and Pivotal, actually at the very birth of Pivotal, Airspan had a hand in, and we were partners from the very early going. And so what ORAN allows us to do is come together with those folks and again, disintermediate those various components, CU, DU, and RU, so we can focus on what we do well and not have to bring to market the entire ecosystem of interest all the way back to the core.
Yes, and that's great, because if you remember a few years ago, the idea was that if you can have Open RAN or whatever we were calling it back then, but it was like, well, it would not be that good, but there are some advantages, but it would be less efficient. And now what we're seeing is that actually that's the opposite, because since you're open to innovation, you can bring in more efficiency, and so you don't have to pay a penalty for it. And maybe Eric, you can tell us a little bit more about that, because I've known you since the WiMAX days, and you guys have been doing a lot of innovations in different ways. So how is this the last chapter with Open RAN? How is that changing what you're doing and your focus?
It's just accelerating trends that we already began in 4G and legitimizing them. And when I say that, I mean it doesn't take it, a super involved, very successful leader like Mukesh Ambani or Masayoshi Son to actually push the concepts into the organization top down. It's all coming from ground up. As these carriers say, how can I possibly compete with my other carriers if I have to spend so much money on spectrum and so much money on tower rental and soccer jersey logos? I can't win. I've got to innovate. So what Open RAN has done is really given a real shot in the arm to the customer base that we have in terms of doing things smarter and being open. And this has meant that it's no longer a closed wall system. So that's been really, really exciting. In terms of the actual technology, we've gotten tremendous improvements in performance from silicon partners like Qualcomm and Intel. We've been able to really get a huge bang for the buck on processing power, on cost per hertz, bringing things that we specialize in together with things that some very significant US-based players like Qualcomm and Intel specialize in, and bring a product that actually runs rings around even the industry leader like Huawei, who's depending on custom ASICs, and basically continuing to do things the way they used to. The analogy I use is they are like the mainframe suppliers in 1981 who just didn't want to see distributed software like Microsoft. They didn't want to see distributed computing, and they thought the old way was going to continue to win. And the nice thing about 5G is it's a catalyst where the carrier's challenges are to move 10 times more information with no more ARPU from customers, to do what Ray talked about, to slice out the networks for many private applications. And so they need a new approach. That approach is all about software. Open RAN really legitimizes or puts some structure around the various interfaces that we had to fight our way in on 4G to make work. In 5G, it's a roadmap that's much more laid out in an orderly way, the way the handset disaggregating from the base station was 15 years back.
Absolutely, and it seems like with Open RAN, everybody benefits, because even if you don't use Open RAN, you still benefit from the innovation that is out there. And also, this has been pushing also the everybody to innovate, even if not just because of that, because there is much more of a push to innovate. And so I would like to ask you how this is, opening the interfaces. How is that benefits? It's not just the DU talking to the CU. It has a much broader effect. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, very much. So we do some projects where we do the layer 1, layer 2. We do some projects where we need a DU out in the network element because the latency, the plumbing, the hoses, as Commissioner Carr spoke about, are not so good, although we've brought tremendous innovation on that side as well. That's another conversation for another day. But the fact is, it's not a one size fits all in distributing the processing. A couple of years back, there was a belief all the processing could be done in a COTS-based server from a major server company. That's been turned on its ear with real practice, because we've seen there are cases where that's the most efficient, but there are cases where the DU needs to be pushed all the way out to the edge of the network, put in the box that's also housing the RAN and the RU software. Of course, that's been super beneficial for us, that we can develop our software platform and then optimize across different physical hardware configurations without starting from scratch. So I think that ability to shift processing all the way from the RU, massive MIMO, scheduling, control the radio, all the way back through orchestration, and put it in the right place for that particular customer makes a tremendous amount of sense. Because it's not a one size fits all in terms of fiber. The hoses of this equation that feed to the sprinklers are very, very different, and it gives a lot more opportunities to use different types of hoses.
Yeah, and absolutely. And this is something that facilitates the path towards Open RAN, because it's not necessarily a one-stop. You just either have it or not have it. You can just evolve the Open RAN. So, for instance, Telefonica is doing all the DUs as a cell site and then move forward. And I've just been looking at this, and it's really fascinating because this makes it possible for every operator, brownfield, greenfield, to get into Open RAN at different paces in different ways, following different paths. So Tim, what about from your point of view, what you're seeing in terms of opening up? What does it allow you to do that you could not do in a closed network?
Yeah, so it's been an enormous enabler for us, because as a small company that's really focused on one core technology and focused within this entire RAN ecosystem, we've been able to go and build out two complete edge to core Open RAN systems operating in our lab, to really take our algorithms and our software and prove it out on these systems with the kind of the reference software designs for DU and CU that are being used in production networks. And so, it's this massive accelerator where we can go get the off-the-shelf, Open RAN components. We can prove out our algorithms. Since we have these open reference designs and interfaces, we can really rapidly leverage the data on those interfaces to help do optimization of the algorithms themselves. So we can do things like online learning of your layer one to really continue improving it in a deployed scenario to operate better and better by itself. So really, it's just been this massive accelerator for us, where we couldn't have done this several years ago in a completely closed system. We would need to go to kind of a large vendor to work very closely with them if we were going to try to really get these algorithms into deployed real world systems and show them. But today we can, within a matter of months, we're able to take this and show on a commercial handset, the benefits and why this really improves the performance in your network.
Can you give us a couple of examples of how can you improve the performance, power consumption? What is it you do?
Right. So we're using machine learning and kind of neural networks largely to do approximation. So a lot of the functions in the L1, when you're doing massive MIMO weight calculation or beam combining, and we're more focused in kind of the sub-6 kind of more macro area than the millimeter wave that we discussed before. But here, these are still really high complexity functions. So if you go to learned approximations of these pieces of the DU algorithms, you can actually reduce the compute required to allow more capacity in these virtualized components and to really help scale to enable massive MIMO at lower cost for operators. And you can actually do a better job. So if you allow this to continue adapting to the channel and the geometry that you're deployed in, you can do better than kind of the textbook statistical signal processing that's done today. So this is really exciting, right? Because you can now win in terms of cost and computational complexity, and you can do better in terms of capacity and resilience and quality of experience for your users.
Okay, so and that's very good. Sorry, it gives us a sense of more of it's here, it's ready to go. It's not just PowerPoint here. And and this is a question that I get all the time. It's like, yes, we talk about there is commitment from the operator, so it's clear that that's the path we're going. But are we ready to go? Can an operator really not just go beyond a trial, beyond a limited deployment? And so maybe you can give us, all of you, we start with Brian. Are we commercial? Are we still waiting?
Yeah, so well, we don't have much of a choice. And I don't think the operators, they understand they don't have much of a choice either. When the the folks like Amazon and Microsoft and Google are leaning in on edge compute, and you're starting to see those partnerships form, there's no more choice. In order to be able to hoist those virtualized, edge networks, I don't think they're going to be able to go back to the incumbents and make that work. This is only going to work within, an open scenario. So I don't think it matters at this point in time. The industry, the pressure on the industry is going to be so great that the folks like Airspan, which have been a leader in the field, and then kind of the new paradigms like Pivotal, being able to actually promulgate this network in very short period of time, out into to realism. And for us, millimeter wave obviously being kind of our focus, because we feel very strongly that ultra wideband and millimeter wave are going to be that whole next generation of the telepresence and the not just in IoT and autonomous driving, but the actual AR, VR, blended realities and telepresence going forward. So whether or not the industry is ready for it, the companies like Pivotal, the companies like Airspan and Deeptig are here. We're ready for it, and the government seems very keen on helping us, push this forward and get this out. So ready or not, here we come.
Eric, what do you?
Yeah, I would say it's happening now. Obviously, Rakuten is a very publicized case. We've got thousands of distributed units installed, and we're putting in over 1,000 a week. There are millimeter wave base stations going in at scale. They've had similar success with other vendors on sub-6, and it is real and it's live and they're commercial customers. So that one is proof point that it is available and working now. In the greenfield case, the skeptics always say, well, that's a greenfield, what about brownfield? I take some of the networks where we've been just going extremely fast on open integrated and point to those as success stories. We're putting in over 500 base stations a day into network in India. It's not fully Open RAN standard compliant, but it has all the same elements, and that's 500 physical outdoor units a day. I was impressed with Commissioner Carr's numbers on available sites. I think that's really great. In the US, I think other countries are going at this light speed there, like India, like China. And so there isn't a need to delay. And then this private 5G is really opening up Open RAN in fantastic ways today. As I said, we had a very strong first part of the year in terms of new customers. We're also feeding traffic now from enterprise people that are deploying open back to carriers. So that's a big pivotal, borrow Brian's great naming. That's a shift in who's putting in the CapEx and who's paying for it. And it also eliminates a very archaic industry, the DAS industry, which I think is going to end up completely obsolete in this. So it's so exciting to see obsolescence being driven at such a rapid pace. And we're very excited, and it is happening now. And countries are embracing it and getting over the skepticism. The Nordic Alliance, as I refer to our competitors, put a huge amount of negative press out into the world that this isn't ready, it's 5 years away. They obviously were like the mainframe sales teams in the early 80s, bringing $1 million computers to solve problems that were being solved at 1/10 or 100th of the cost. So I think it's ready now.
Yeah, so Tim, before, let me add something to my initial question. We just got a question from the audience about 6G. So my initial question is, are we ready? The other thing that sometimes people start talking about, yes, we're ready, but we really should wait for 6G, which I think it's a kind of a dangerous road to go. Clearly 6G is coming, but we should not be waiting for 6G or 5.5G. I think, in technology, if you wait for the next generation all the time, you're never going to go anywhere. So what is your view about the impact as we go? We're ready now, but what about 6G? Should we wait? Is that going to change things dramatically, or what's the role of 6G?
Yeah, so I don't think you ever wait, right? You have to start building things and iterating and improving things. And I think the path to 6G is going to be very incremental. as we've seen. And so, we can start today with a lot of the AI and the RAN concepts that may be core to 6G and use them in kind of transparent implementation ways. And so, what we've started to do is really build out, ML-driven RAN and L1 very quickly with today's technologies in a standards compliant way. But I think it's exciting in that as you start allowing small changes to the standard or to coordination between components, you can really start building a much more AI-driven RAN, as it evolves into something that might be a completely AI-driven RAN once we get to 6G. And so I think Open RAN is huge because it allows us to have, applied solutions that can go into networks and be useful. We're not just doing academic research. We're not just doing simulations. We can build competitive organizations and small companies that build these capabilities, really vet them in the real world. And as we evolve this to allow, more co-adaptation between the RAN side and the UE, we're going to allow more dynamic systems. And so, it allows us to really prototype things that could become 6G, but use Open RAN components and a lot of the components of today's network to get there kind of incrementally. So I think, the US, as we look to invest in 6G and becoming a leader in 6G internationally in R&D, we should really use Open RAN as a tool to get there and not just look at funding academic research alone. We really need to focus on this applied, product-driven, ready for market kind of incremental way to get there.
Yeah, and I think Eric wants to say something. For all of you in the audience, it's your time to ask questions if you have any. Eric.
Just to follow up on Tim's excellent comments there, the fact that 5G opens up highways that we never saw before, millimeter wave, which Brian knows and loves, those are 400 megahertz wide channels, 800 megahertz coming soon. Just 2 years ago, we were wrestling with 5 megahertz channels. And so just the simple physics of the highway getting that much larger, obviously millimeter wave has luxury there, challenged by propagation, but in sub-6, we're dealing with 100 megahertz channels. And so I think the idea that we would wait, that makes no sense. I think all the innovative steps that are needed are there in 5G. I also think the carriers don't have a commercial alternative, but to work differently than they worked in the last two decades with those big walled garden suppliers. So it's certainly something I wouldn't bet on the next generation as the way of holding, if anything, that's a publicity stunt by those big folks who have the most to lose to hold off anybody doing anything innovative.
Actually, I have to disagree with you. When you talk about the challenges of propagation, it's not a challenge. It's actually, and it's becoming an advantage. And I think that this is actually the cool thing, is that with technology innovation, things that used to be a problem, we didn't know what to do with millimeter wave spectrum, right? And now, the propagation limitations are actually good because that means frequency reuse.
Yeah, I totally agree.
I'm an old school, Motorola guy. So I've been doing propagation analysis a long time. And, for me, if you came to me and you didn't tell me where the spectrum was, but you told me, hey, this spectrum likes to go in straight lines and isn't subject to weird fading environments or phases of the moon, and you can aggressively reuse it. And oh, by the way, because the wavelength is so short, you can have really nice beamforming packages. Or you can worry about reflections off of buildings and 700 megahertz that goes forever. If you just gave me that as a propagation analyst, I'd say, well, there's no question. I want the more deterministic way. And but obviously with that has to come a very cost-effective, quick time to market, lightweight, like Pivot is here, hanging on a pole, rather than there's no fiber, draws 30 watts. You can hang it anywhere. CLEX can hang it in the right of way. And for this to be able to use that in a hub and spoke fashion to organically grow a network is something that's, obviously very novel. And the type of breakthrough that you see outside of the Nordics, as Eric has said. I did want to add one thing on top of what Eric had built with his discussion about private NR. And private NR, I think, will definitely be kind of the foundational piece. We'll provide the ballast of support to make sure this is a 5G technology. Because private NR, they'll immediately, they've already seen it. So whether it's, you know, what Verizon's done with Walgreens, for instance, or folks like that, where, you know, they'll come together and they'll see immediately, you know, what they can do with private NR. And the carriers will embrace it because they have that network slice. They own it. That's their customers. They can profit from that, and the customers will be happy about it. So from that perspective, this is not a 6G. This is a 5G technology for sure.
Absolutely. Now let's try to sort of stand back from where you guys are, you know, personally involved, and let's look at the role of technological innovation from you know, the smaller companies, not what you call the Nordics, the you know, people like you guys. So what advice can you give, and what do you think the role is for companies like you in creating innovation within the Open RAN system? Who wants to go first?
I just want to jump in real quick because Eric and I go back a long way. We, you know, I sat on the WiMAX Forum board of directors with Paul Sr. and knew Airspan back in those days also. And so, you know, and again, this actually leans back to what's happening in the world with the nexus of security, with the nexus of, you know, who gets to define next generation of networks, and also with the government leaning in and doing what it's doing. Has essentially, so the advice is that there's a lot of people that have paved this road, and you have to believe that telecom is actually cool again. So, you know, we're in a space that I haven't seen since the 1990s, where telecom is a highly investable foray at this point in time. Take advantage of it. And this is very much, in my mind, the path that Datacom took. So we've heard the metaphors about the PC and the mainframe. I'd like to actually extend that out to, say, when Cisco had a hegemony on Datacom, and then all of a sudden a lot of systems integrators came in and figured, oh, you can still use your Cisco switch, but you can use someone else's IP filter or someone else's firewall or proxy, this, that, and the other. And that ecosystem flourished. So it's the same thing at this point in time. I think you need to view yourself as being at the precipice of, again, that new opening, and believe in it.
Yeah, and I would add to that too, that we're at this precipice of artificial intelligence and machine learning just weaving itself throughout the communication stack at almost every level to do this optimization. And we've seen it be extremely transformative in the vision and the voice fields today. And we're really just starting to see that really drastically change the way communication systems are built too. And we've seen a lot of that at the SON and the kind of network optimization layer. But all of this happening at the same time as the lower layers being able to really embrace and leverage data in a way we couldn't do before, to really model channels very, very well and actually exploit, all of the information we can to improve propagation. It makes this even more kind of exciting that this is all happening at the same time. So I think there's many opportunities for startups to really focus on key areas there that aren't being looked at.
Yeah, and I guess to add, the beauty of what Tariq Amin testified a couple of days ago to Congress, and it was such an encouraging journey that he described, and just setting out and doing it as opposed to just talking about it. And that's really the nice thing in Open RAN, is smaller participants can be a part of that, where that kind of seat at the table was impossible 3 or 4 years ago. So I think as Tim says, it's allowing that. And then as Brian said, this access to capital. The capital is coming from people that see the future and see this as a 10-year cycle. I think it's the largest CapEx cycle of my career, without bar none. So I think it's a really exciting time for startups, for new companies, and Open RAN just helps all of that. It's also super important for the US as an exporter. Turn the equation back to where it was in the 1980s in terms of we are a net exporter, we're not a net importer. The Silicon Valley gained phenomenally from the plumbing that 4G put in place, as I think was touched on in the earlier session. And now is our opportunity to gain in real solid industrial stuff in the infrastructure.
Yeah, and since Brian mentioned WiMAX, I have to go back to that, because when you think about it, WiMAX never went anywhere, but and it was not an Open RAN type of thing, but it was a non-3GPP thing, and it actually had a lot of an impact that it was somewhat similar to what Open RAN is having in terms of opening up to innovation, to new companies, and you both you, Brian and Eric, were into that. And so you can see that even that, which was just opening a little bit, created such a huge amount of innovation. So WiMAX lost the battle, but it won the war. It really changed things.
And we're
Awesome.
seeing something very similar now in the IEEE. We bought a company called Mimosa in Silicon Valley, best of breed at building very low cost, the hoses of the conversation. So we can now do 3 gigabits for under $1,000 for both ends in the newly released FCC 6 gigahertz. I don't know if Commissioner Carr's listening, but that also is just a huge improvement in what's going to happen on the plumbing side of the equation. So it's, as you said, disruptive. If you remember, Intel in WiMAX was a driver to get into an ecosystem they had been excluded from. And here we are a decade later, and Intel's a major participant in 5G. So
yeah,
absolutely.
so it's actually, you know, Open RAN is nothing new in that respect. I mean, we've noted that this is an approach that works.
Right.
It's not like we're not, you know, making this up. So now let's look at it. What is that you guys can do to guide policy, and what is that policy can do to help you and the Open RAN ecosystem? Because clearly you're going strong on your own. You don't need, you know, you're doing well. But what is that we can do to improve it, or you can do, and in terms of policy can be done?
Well, dollars are certainly going to be important. And, you know, so the USA Telecom Act that slid in last year under the NDAA was an important first step with, you know, putting NTIA on point to start to allocate funds for, you know, to rebuild this enduring ecosystem of infrastructure. I mean, we need the next Motorola, we need, or Lucent. You know, and that should come from the U.S. At least I believe that. And I mean, Open RAN obviously has an international outlook, and as they should. And but we really need these policymakers to continue on the path that they've been on actually for a few years. And the FCC and the Wireless Bureau and NTIA have all done a wonderful job of opening this up and kind of setting the table. So it's time to really feast at this point in time. I think the money's got to be spent, you know, obviously very intelligently. I would think that from a government perspective, they could probably effectively spend money to make sure that interoperability is achieved, and perhaps sponsors, you know, a third-party organization, a CTIA or someone of similar ilk, to actually come along and put together, you know, those types of compliance laboratories where that type of testing can be done, so that we can all, you know, talk to each other, so we don't end up with a SIPRI, which basically was the driver behind all of this, for all of us to come together. But so from that perspective, and then also to co-invest alongside, you know, private equity and venture capital, I think that would actually help, you know, engender the marketplace too. But, and then it shouldn't be off the table that, you know, even with brownfield and greenfield operators, maybe they co-invest there also, especially if they hit metrics that are near and dear to their hearts, say for digital divide issues or rural telecom and connectivity issues. So maybe they side by side invest in those types of networks to actually get real gear in the ground.
No other comments?
Well, no, I think Brian hit a lot of the key points. We've been working very closely with the UK government, and they've just issued a diversification report that's really captured a lot of really important ideas. I think incentives are useful for the carriers to do things differently. I don't think they're as essential as some people think, because I think the economics of the market are going to drive them to have to do things differently. But certainly the interop, the support of the industry, and a reality check. I think the rip and replace money, we spent the weekend on the price book for rip and replace, and sadly it's still read like the mainframe part number description, because I think there's some catch up that has to be done on, you know, understanding what all these elements look like in their new form, not just taking what the old form was sold by the few that we've talked about already, the Nordic Alliance. So I think driving that public spend into spending money for something that gives us a better collection of tools is so important, not just to take out Huawei and replace with a Nordic equivalent of Huawei at double the price. So there's a tremendous opportunity here. We have to make sure we don't just spin the, and I think again, Commissioner Carr mentioned the site acquisition and cost of deploy, and make sure we get more of the money in the, what we call the smart side of the spend, which is bits per hertz. It's the stuff that Deeptig is doing, and not have it all go into you know, cabling and plumbing and weight and measure analysis on towers.
Yeah, I think there's to echo that too. I mean, definitely we need to be investing, you know, not just in test beds and rollouts, but also investing in R&D and new technology, but doing so on an applied side. So not, you know, not something that's just abstract. We really need people that are building out, you know, new technology in a way that can be used. And so Open RAN is an amazing enabler for that, and for making sure that the work that we fund is relevant to you know, real networks, to real deployment scenarios, to real needs. And so yeah, I would really, I think focusing on that technology R&D within an applied context is really the sweet spot where we can make major progress in accelerating 5G and 6G you know, leadership.
Yeah, so all of you guys work with people within the US, other countries, so you have the whole global view. How do you think that US is doing at this point? Are we behind, ahead? Should we do things differently?
I think we're doing pretty well. I think
That's it's at the end of the day. So,
markets like Japan and India are definitely ahead. I think they have the impetus and also a liberation from Huawei. But I think we're doing quite well in terms of the overall intent. I think now it's the phase to get action.
I don't want to necessarily go down the same groove path here, but where we do lead in the world obviously is in millimeter wave. So the Chinese are still quite a ways behind. The pioneers at Verizon have cut a tremendous machete line into the world with millimeter wave for lots to follow behind, and have done just a wonderful job of it. And other carriers have started to put their time and efforts into it too. So from that perspective, I think that's a fight we'll win in the world, and we'll certainly be leaders there. And again, back to I think Eric had said, that's going to be the impetus that's going to drive whether it's Oculus or the next generation of heads-up displays or VR, AR, and those applications and those devices are going to be driven by that throughput and that capability. So there we lead. And it's going to be a knife fight for sub-6, I think, with the rest of the world network-wise.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's ways in which we could improve our approach where we really focus on RAN technology and build and applied RAN technology. I think there's been a lot of focus on applications and on deployments, and then there's been this focus on the very far side of just basic science, but there's really kind of a gap in the middle of those things that hasn't gotten the attention that I think it needs. So I think I think we could do a much better job of really focusing there in the future.
Yeah, so I would like to thank you. You guys gave a great view of what is the life in innovating in Open RAN, the daily, what is that you guys are doing. But before we go, I would like to ask you to give to the audience your final thoughts on Open RAN and innovation. What is there? What is that it's important to you, and how you view it? So your final thoughts. Who wants to go first?
I'll jump in. So so speaking from Pivotal's perspective, and let me speak to the innovators. Let me speak to the entrepreneurs and the startups, because we started in 2016, obviously had some great technology to stand on, but as we started to make our way in the world and sat down and became a delegate in 3GPP, and the rest of 3GPP is looking their nose down at Pivotal. And it's like, what do you guys know? Who are you? Where are you guys from? Who cares? I don't care. And so, but then all of a sudden, we're in XRAN and then ORAN, and then as they come together, we're sitting in a meeting and they're talking about beam parameters. And our delegate raises his hand and says, well, we know a little something about beam parameters. And the way you're doing it is really not abstracted enough from the real world, and it should be done in much more of a geometric framework. And they're looking at us like, well, you guys do seem to know a lot about this. And I said, why don't you just write them? Why don't you write those beam parameters and then let us discuss them and promulgate them? And they did, and we did. And so that's what ORAN's meant to us, is this ability for us to actually have a voice with the expertise we have. We don't have expertise in everything, but the things we're really good at, we're really good at. And so that's what ORAN allowed us to do, is come in and have a voice at the table and watch this come together. So my hat's off.
Okay, voice at the table. That's a very good one. Eric, Tim?
Yeah, I'm looking at this in business terms. The costs of service in the US is one of the highest in the world. Some of our customers have an ARPU and make money at 1/10 of the prices here. So I think when we look back in 2 years and Open RAN succeeds, we're going to see ARPUs that are much more like the rest of the world. So that's really what I'm expecting out of this. I think that metric and the metric of the unconnected should be the two by which we judge the success or failure. We have 23 million homes today that don't have broadband of any form. Let's see if we can use this innovation to solve those 2 points. And I think it's a really good way to do it with this platform.
Yeah, I guess that, yeah, moving to greater efficiency, that would be a great thing. I mean, there is a lot of room there. What about you, Tim?
Yeah, I mean, for us, I think I've said, this has just been really a massive accelerator to get an entire stack and system to build and prove out this technology on. I mean, moving to machine learning in the PHY and in the L1 is viewed as kind of a radical approach. And so you really need the proof points to show why this helps you, how this really works in macro cells and prove out the technology. And so we couldn't do this with simulation. We couldn't do this other ways. And I think it's also exciting because Open RAN gives us this great virtualized ecosystem where we can just provide software enhancements to many of the Open RAN systems that are being deployed to really improve them with just software modifications. So it opens up this entire ecosystem where software improvements and enhancements can really focus on the good they can do and then be rolled out very quickly into these deployments.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it just makes the whole path towards virtualization is like the final push to it. Well, I would like to thank you all. I have many more questions I could ask you. There's a lot of content. We need to stop. Let's continue with our days. So I would like to thank you so much. And it was great to have the opportunity to moderate this panel.
As always, thank you, Monica.
Thank you.
And,
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Oh, and I think that this will be available offline, but I think that maybe you can give more instructions on this.
Absolutely. So first of all, I just want to thank all our speakers and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar on Startup Innovation in the Open RAN ecosystem. Now, like she mentioned, Hamak mentioned, a recording of today's webinar will be available on the Open RAN Policy Coalition's website. And with that, on behalf of the Open RAN Policy Coalition and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day. Goodbye, everyone.